9 university students went on a trip between the snowy mountains in Russia. The 9 travelers were very excited about the trip, and one day after the night approached, they pitched their tent on the side of a mountain slope. But after darkness fell on that night, they would face something frightening, the likes of which they had never seen. A frightening event or thing that the 9 who Dyatlov faced will become one of the most famous and mysterious cases in history. This incident will be called the Dyatlov Crossing case, and it may have come across to you. Many have covered it before me, but this is one of the most mysterious cases, and I knew that I would make a video about it sooner or later. So even if you have come across this case before, God willing, I will present it to you in a different style and you will enjoy it. Hello, Bilal is with you. The Dyatlov Crossing case is considered a very old incident that took place in 1959, meaning 65 years ago. The events occurred in Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. A group of 10 adventurers consisting of 8 young men and 2 girls, most of whom were university students, decided to embark on a trip to one of the mountainous regions of the country. Their ages ranged between 20 and 23 years, with one exception, a 30-year-old who was not a student or had just graduated. Despite their young age, these adventurers were not new to such experiences, as this trip was not their first. No, these were not novice travelers. They were experienced adventurers with significant experience. The mountainous region they chose to explore is known as the Ural Mountains, located in Siberia. Siberia, as you may know, is renowned for being one of the coldest and most challenging regions in Russia. Why did these adventurers specifically target this demanding mountainous region? The reason is rooted in the existence of an association or union for travelers and adventurers within the Soviet Union at that time. The association had 3 classifications: the first level, the second level, and the third level, and the 10 Hazela belonged to the second level. Their collective ambition was to advance to the third level, a feat achievable only through undertaking a challenging expedition. Hence, the goal of this particular trip was to attain the coveted third level, and interestingly, their university sponsored. They were the ones who sponsored them. All of them were members of the sports club at the university, with the trip's leader among them. The group of 10 was led by a 23-year-old young man named Igor Dyatlov, who happened to be the most experienced. Dyatlov and his friends embarked on this journey in January 1959. They were residing in a city quite distant from the mountains, and this is where they decided to set the stage for their adventure. To reach the mountains, their initial step was to board a train. Upon reaching Siberia, they continued their journey on a bus and later on a truck that transported them to the foothills of the mountain region. Once at the mountains, they furthered their expedition using horse-drawn sleds and subsequently continued on. Of course, all the pictures you are currently observing are authentic captures taken by the travelers themselves. They were equipped with cameras to document their journey, and alongside that, they maintained diaries to meticulously record the unfolding event. This documentation was integral to their trip, given their association membership and their aspiration to reach the third level from the trip's outset. Despite the group's overall excitement for the adventure, one member named Yudin began experiencing severe back pain early on. Just 2 days into the journey, feeling unable to continue, he decided to turn back, abandoning both his friends and his inn to reach the third level. Undoubtedly, he felt a mix of sadness and regret at that moment. However, in hindsight, he would come to realize that his back pain spared him from sharing the ominous fate that awaited the group. The pictures capture the moment of his farewell, with Yuri smiling, oblivious to the fact that this would be their final goodbye. With Yudin's departure, the group was reduced to 9 members. The adventurers pressed on with their journey through the Ural Mountains. As night descended, they would pitch their tent, spending each night in it, gradually venturing deeper into the mountainous terrain. After a few days of trekking, they arrived at a mountain known to locals as the Mountain of Death. While some sources mention it as the Mountain of the Wind, the prevailing term is the Mountain of Death. The significance lies in the satellite image depicting the mountain's peak and the route they traversed, descending along the mountain's base. The 9 adventurers then climbed along its slope, reaching a specific point. At this juncture, night descended upon them, prompting them to set up their tent. Positioned on the mountain slope, they had to excavate the snow to create a flat surface for their tent as depicted in the image before you. The 9 travelers slept in their tent that night, unaware that it would mark the final night of their lives. During this fateful night, a calamity befell them, transforming their expedition into one of the most peculiar and enigmatic incidents in recent history. The last entry in their records came from the diary of one of them, a proficient writer. It's perplexing to fathom such serenity atop a mountain amid a raging snowstorm, miles away from any human habitation. Essentially, she conveyed a sense of comfort within their tent, amidst the tempestuous snowstorm and brutal cold. She felt comfortable even though they were hundreds away, kilometers away from any human civilization. And what we understand from this writing that she got in her diary is that she did not know. No feelings and no fear, neither she nor her friends, about the calamity that would befall them that night. They had no idea. On the contrary, she was saying that she was at ease after this. Tonight, the 9 travelers' contact with the outside world was completely cut off. Their journey was not supposed to last more than 2 weeks. But 3 weeks passed without any trace of them, and their relatives and friends seemed to feel anxious. Their families and friends gathered and formed a team of volunteers to go and search for them. And after a few days of searching in the mountainous areas, they were able to finally get their tent. The tent was collapsed and covered with a layer of snow, which means that the tent had remained in this place for weeks, which means that a disaster had befallen the 9 travelers, and they were not leaving their tent there. What was worse was that the tent was cut with a knife from the inside, meaning the tent had a door or an exit. But for some reason, the travelers were forced to cut the tent with a knife from the inside to get out of it. This means that they were forced to escape from something. Either something that was inside the tent or something outside that blocked the exit for them. So they were forced to get out from the other side by cutting through the tent. A search team began to circle the tent, and at length they noticed remnants of light footprints on the snow. This is a strange thing that these footprints remain throughout this period, especially with the storms and continuous snowfall. However, it seems that the presence of these footprints on the slope of this mountain means that the footprints were tilted. This thing reduces their snow coverage, So the strange traces of them remained after that. These footprints were organized and the distances between them were small, which indicates that the travelers' descent from the mountain after they came out of the tent was calm. They were not sitting running or running away from something. If anyone escapes or runs, the distance between his footprints will be wider and his movement will be disorganized, especially since there were 9 people and their footprints kept walking together. If you are running away, we would have seen the footprints dispersed in every direction. These footprints continued to descend from the mountain for a distance of approximately 500 meters. To make the scene clearer in your minds, let us draw on this picture. As we say, this is the top of the mountain, and this point, when the travelers set up their tent on the slope of the mountain, the research team found footprints around the tent. These tracks were leading to this road on the slope of the mountain. I mean, the travelers were sitting down on the mountain. These tracks continued from the tent to the bottom of the mountain for a distance of approximately 500 meters. And after that, they disappeared. The ground became more flat due to the snow. The remaining traces were buried, but even after the traces disappeared, the research team continued in the same direction, and at a distance of approximately 1,500 meters from the tent, they reached an area with trees. At the beginning of the forest at the bottom of the mountain, in the middle of these trees, they found the remains of a fire. It is clear that the travelers tried to get wood and light a fire to bury themselves in. In this place, between these trees, close to the remains of this fire, they found the first 2 bodies of the 9 traveler bodies. Their bodies were clearly covered in the condition they were in. But I cannot show you these pictures because YouTube creates problems for us. So whoever wants to see the pictures, do a quick search on Google and it will happen. The most important thing is that we can say that the situation in which the 2 bodies were found was not normal at all, even if it was summer. They did not wear these little clothes, never mind in the middle of a snowstorm with a temperature reaching -30. Colder than the freezer of the refrigerator man. Of course, we do not need to say that the cause of their death was the temperature of their bodies dropped. They died from freezing, but other than freezing, their bodies had traces of several blows and wounds in different places. One of them had the tip of his nose gone, and the second had the skin on his hand from being dragged. The position of the bodies was not as if they had frozen, but only in blows and traces of wounds. If only they could imagine that one of them was Carno. Cinco got a piece of flesh from his hand and mouth, meaning he most likely bit himself. So this was something additional that made the matter even more strange. After they got the 2 bodies, they continued the search and got a new body at a distance. Not far from them, but this body was as if it was heading towards the tent, meaning this person was trying to return to the tent again. This body was that of the leader of the expedition, Dyatlov, and the people who call this area after it call the Dyatlov Crossing. And this whole case is famous for its name. The cause of Dyatlov's death was hypothermia. And they also found traces of wounds and blows. If anything beyond this, there was congealed blood on his face from in terms of clothing. He was dressed better than the 2 friends he found under the trees, but his clothes were still considered less than usual, especially given the weather they were in originally, in this atmosphere and in the middle of this snowstorm. Even if you were wearing clothes, you could not survive without a fire or a means of heating. And this may be the reason. Let him try to return to the tent because, as we said, they found him walking towards the tent and sitting towards the mountain because the tent had a furnace and a cannon. Look. For example, this is a picture of the tent when they set it up in a second place before the mountain. This is the stove's chimney. This is the only logical reason that to make him try to return to the tent a second time other than his corpse. Dyatlov also obtained 2 bodies on this path, the path back to the tent. The first body was one of the 2 girls, and the second body was one of the young men. In the same way, their bodies had traces of blows and wounds on the girl until she had many marks of blows on her face. Now, as we see in this illustration, they obtained 5 bodies. The first, something about the 2 corpses at the trees, and then the 3 corpses along the mountain slope of the people who tried to return. Can someone say, maybe these 3 people who were on the slope died? They were going down and they were not coming up. The answer to this question is that they got their bodies towards the ascent. If they had died while coming down, it would have had their bodies towards the inn. These 5 bodies were all found behind each other, especially the last 2 bodies. Of course, the authorities came, specialized search teams came, and a large number of people participated in the search. But this is Siberia and a mountainous region, and in the depths of winter, the snow does not stop the freezing cold. Vision is difficult, so the search work was not smooth at all, and it took weeks for the 5 bodies to be found. As for the remaining 4 bodies, it took 2 months, even though they were not far from this place, but they were located in a completely different direction. The remaining 4 bodies were found in this area, opposite the direction of the tent. The reason that made the search teams delay in finding them is because these bodies were buried under 4 meters of snow. The search teams were not able to find them at all. What they did find was a group of indigenous people who live in this area in these mountains. These indigenous people are called the mountainside tribes. It seems that they were the ones who obtained the place where the remaining 4 people were buried. How? They found it while they were buried under 4 meters of snow. I don't know if it could be because they are the people of the area. It is a shame where the nature and shape of the place is. When the snow subsided, they saw that there was something abnormal in this place. Maybe God knows best. The important thing is that members of these Mansi tribes were the ones who led the search teams to the location of the remaining 4 bodies. Indeed, the search teams came and dug in the place, and after they had dug 4 meters in the snow, they found in front of them like a snow den a hole dug in the snow, and its floor was covered with tree branches. Found in this den pieces of clothing, some of which were cut into trousers that were cut in half. They dug after more than 2 years in this den and found the bodies. The remaining 4 bodies were next to each other, and underneath them there was a stream of water coming down from the mountain. They were piled up on top of the stream of water, which is underground and under the snow, and the water was still flowing. I don't know. This description shows you the scene in real pictures, of course, for the condition of the bodies and their appearance when they got them, but it's not the same thing. I can put it to you because YouTube creates problems for us. So I hope that the scene is clear in your minds. This is a picture and an illustration of the situation in which the bodies were counted, just as you see a deep hole in the snow with a water stream underneath it, and the bodies lying in the water stream. The bottom line is that they found these 4 bodies next to each other, a little above an underground water stream, and next to them was a den dug in the snow. It seemed that they were the ones who were digging it, trying to take shelter from the storm. With their discovery of these 4 bodies, the 9 bodies of all the travelers were completed. The problem is that the condition of these last 4 bodies that they found was much more violent than the 5 bodies they obtained before these 4 bodies were the 3 young men and the last girl in the group. The girl received ribs in her rib cage broken on the right and left. 4 ribs on the right and 6 ribs on the left. One of the 3 young men, who was in fact the eldest of them, the man who was in his 30s, received after 5 of the ribs of the rib cage were broken on the right side, and in a young man after their skull was severely fractured on the right side. All of them were injuries. The medical autopsy said that they were fatal injuries. The 4th young man did not have serious injuries like these 3, so the cause of his death was the drop in his body temperature until the 3. They had fatal injuries. They were frozen. We do not know whether they died from the injuries or from freezing, which preceded the 2nd. So the question here is how they sustained these severe injuries. The investigation reports compared their injuries to injuries resulting from bombs or violent car accidents. So what could have caused them these strange injuries and injuries? Finish here, the girl's eyes, tongue, and the bottom of her mouth were not there. Someone had gouged out her eyes, cut off her tongue and the bottom of her mouth and taken them with him. The same thing happened with the 30-something man whose rib cage was broken. His eyes were no longer there. Now I think you understand why this case became one of the most famous cases due to the amount of strange events. What is in it and the conditions in which they bodies of the 9 travelers make the mystery reach a 2nd level. Is it plausible that someone or an entity, for example, killed them or caused their death? The Soviet investigators who caught this case put it at the top of the list of possibilities that this could be a crime and began investigating the case as a crime because the injuries they inflicted on the bodies seemed to be looking for people who could be suspected of a crime like this. The Siberian region had harsh detention centers and prisons designated for criminals and political prisoners. They put them in these detention centers in the middle of the snow and the cold and broke their backs with hard labor. There was one of these detention centers at a distance of not much distance, far from the mountain where the 9 travelers died. The first possibility that the investigators thought of was that they might be prisoners who had escaped from the detention center and were facing the same condition. So the lover contacted the administration of this prison and asked him if there were any prisoners who had escaped during the past period. But the answer was no. There were no prisoners who had escaped during this period. The 2nd lead that the investigators followed was Ural, the 10th member of the group who suffered from back pain at the beginning of the trip, and he returned and left his friends. The lovers summoned him, investigated him, and treated him as a suspect. They raised the possibility that this might be a plot on his part, and that he hated his friends and wanted to get rid of them. So he made a plan to get rid of them in the mountain, away from people's eyes. But Ural explained to them that his return was due to back pain, and that he had originally returned from the beginning of the trip before the events on the mountain happened. Of course, during the investigation, Ural was nervous, meaning his friends were dead, and he had a miraculous birth because he was not with them. And then they were. The investigators were suspicious of him and putting pressure on him, but this tension made them suspicious of him even more. And they even detained him to confirm his innocence. But then they were able to confirm that Yuri actually returned to his town and that he was with his family during the period when his friends were in the mountain. And a number of witnesses confirmed this thing. Fury came out of the list of suspects, but the investigators decided to use him and let him help them in the investigation. So they took him to the mountain and let him inspect the place, and then left him to see the bodies of his friends at the autopsy doctor, which was definitely a shocking experience for him to see them in this way, especially if he was supposed to be with them. But at least Yuri gave the investigators a useful note, which was that some of his friends were wearing the clothes of their second friends. And this may explain the situation in which they found the first two bodies in their underwear. They may have been the first to die. The rest of them took their clothes to bury themselves in. The investigators completed their investigations, and 6 of the suspects were members of the Mansi tribes, the indigenous people living in the area. These mountains, and you say, wait a minute, it's not all men. They are the ones who helped the search teams to get the last 4 bodies. I say yes, that's right. And this was one of the reasons that made investigators suspicious of them, especially since the bodies were buried under 4 meters of snow. Mansi is correct. Surely they know the area better than those, but it remains a confusing question. How did they know that they were buried in this particular place? Moreover, on top of this forgotten place, they consider their mountainous areas to be sacred areas, and no one is supposed to come and enter them. This is normal. If it is part of their religious customs that any women other than women are forbidden from entering these sacred lands of theirs, and the travelers are in their group. They were with 2 girls, so Al-Muhab sat with some members of the mountainside tribes, and he interrogated them, but all the Mansi members denied any connection to the death of the 9 travelers. But during the investigations with them, a strange detail emerged. More than one person from the Mansi testified that they saw a strange light in the sky on the night that the travelers were believed to have died in it. They described it as a very bright light, and its movement was fast. And from here emerges one of the many strange theories that were used to explain the events of the case, which is the alien theory. This is only one of the vague theories that have emerged regarding this case. We return to investigate most of the evidence that the investigators and research teams obtained at the mountain. They collected the bodies and took them to the laboratories to examine one of the strange surprises they received. Some of the clothes that the travelers were wearing had a fairly strong nuclear radiation on them. They were not just light traces. Imagine nuclear radiation. It means as if they were in a nuclear zone. This should be new evidence that will push the investigators to dig deep. There is more to the case. But the surprise is that shortly after that, specifically on May 28, 1959, the investigators announced the closure of the case. The investigation only lasted for 3 months, and the Soviet authorities cordoned off the mountain area and prevented anyone from entering it. And this is what, of course, increases the severity of the wild theories and conspiracy theories in the case in this report. The final conclusion of the investigation ended with the conclusion that the case was not solved, and that the 9 travelers encountered an unknown natural force that they could not deal with. This is literally the description that ended in the investigators' report. An unknown natural force that they could not deal with. From that day to this day, about 65 years have passed during this period. 65 years, this case has continued to become famous, and theories and analyses have not been resolved. This has increased as we entered the age of the internet. The issue has become more famous and the theories have increased. Some are vague theories, some are conspiracy theories, and some are scientific theories. We do not touch upon very vague theories such as aliens, but we see some supernatural theories and some conspiracy theories, and we see scientific theories. The theories that we focus on will be the most logical theories, even if they are not completely logical. Most of them will be at least logical, and I think that we will reach a good idea of what happened. Let us start with the conspiracy theory. The theory that the government of the Soviet Union covered up the case in order to hide some secrets, of course. As we said, the events of the case took place in the year 1959, and the world at that time was at the height of the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. During that period, the Soviet Union was doing everything they could in order to be the dominant power in the world. This period was a period of developing tests and experiments, especially in the military aspects. The Soviet Union wanted to get ahead of America, so there were many secret sites in which experiments were conducted, whether on weapons, chemicals, or other materials, some of which could be immoral or even brutal. So, the conspiracy and secret experiments begin from the point of discovering the effects of nuclear radiation on some of the travelers' clothes. Why their clothes? It had nuclear radiation on it, so that when the funeral took place, many of their families and people close to them noticed that their bodies had become orange, and some of their bodies had traces of burns on them, which could be a strong indication of poisoning with nuclear radiation. So what is the source of this radiation, and where did it come from? Some of the families and people of the travelers stated that we are certain, without a doubt, that the army, the military forces, and the government have a hand in this. This is something that the army is covering up. You remember the light that members of the Mansi tribe said they saw on top of the mountain. The conspiracy theory says that this light was a missile or a weapon fired from a military base. This missile, it failed to take off and collapsed in a place close to the mountain, then exploded. There could be radioactive nuclear materials inside it, so the after-explosion wave was released and covered the area with some nuclear radiation. At the same time, it shook the travelers' tent, so they panicked and left it. If you remember, after the footprints they made on the outside, the tent was tidy. Most likely, this means that they did not come out in panic. Otherwise, there is no explanation in this theory for the matter that they tore open the tent from the inside in order to get out of it. And after that, if the area had been covered with nuclear radiation, there would be traces of this radiation in the place unless the government closed the area and left no one to examine the nuclear radiation. And in fact, the government then cordoned off the area and prevented anyone from entering it for a long period. But was this really because they prevented anyone from examining nuclear radiation in the place? I don't know. They mentioned after that at that time, use of nuclear energy was in its infancy. So there were not many people who were aware of the negative effects that could be dealt with. Nuclear radiation, which increases the severity of the conspiracy theory in this case, is that one of the 9 was suspected of being an intelligence spy or a security man. This person's name was Semyon Zolotaryov. This person whom I told you at the beginning of the story was not a student and was even in his 30s. 37. This person, who I told you at the beginning of the story, was not a student. 30s. The person was not part of this group in the first place. This person was literally put by the government at the last minute before the trip began. Because this trip, as I told you before, was funded by the university in which they were studying, so it was as if they were being monitored. Would university put him in a monitor? It is on them, not the government, that put him down. This man was doubtful that he was a security man or an intelligence officer in the KGB, which is the Soviet intelligence. Even when they researched his history, they found that he was a soldier and participated in World War II. So why was a person like this put down by the government and them? Was it his presence? In order to prevent them from going to certain areas that the government does not want them to see. It is possible that even if the government had no direct involvement in the traveler's death, it may have been in the government's interest to cover up this issue and not allow many parties to interfere in it, because this matter could lead to the revelation of military secrets. Even Ural, the 10th member of the group who survived because he returned at the beginning of the journey, believed that the government had a hand in the matter, or at least wanted to cover up some things. In 2013, before he died, he revealed one of the secrets while on his deathbed. He said that he was helping investigators classify the items they had obtained about the bodies, and on the mountain he was surprised because he noticed the presence of some items that did not belong to any of them. Military gloves and glasses that looked strange, and then additional skis. Things that he was sure not in the possession of any of them. So where did these items come from? Ural said on his deathbed that he believed that the government staged all this in order to convince everyone that the death of their companions was natural. But the real cause of death was the secret experiments that the army was conducting in the region. It is not known whether this was a deliberate experiment or an unintended mistake. This conspiracy theory has some aspects that deserve one to think about it now. We move to the theory of the supernatural. Mountains in Russia and mountains in Asia in general are known for some legends about strange beings or creatures living in them. One of these legendary beings is the creature they call the Yeti. The Yeti is supposed to be a being that resembles a human in its stature and walks on two legs. But its body is covered with hair and its shape is closer to a monkey, or the gorilla is a huge creature that is supposed to have frightening powers. The supernatural view of nature suggests that the travelers encountered the Yeti creature that night, and because of its attack on their tent, they were forced to flee from it. The theory of the Yeti creature began because of a picture they obtained in one of the travelers' cameras. In this picture, we see the shadow of the creature resembling humans in its structure. A sitting creature is walking between the trees and appears in the picture as if it is watching the traveler from afar. Some people who analyze the picture say that this creature is 3 meters tall, and they started saying that this is the first real picture of a Yeti, and this is what started this whole theory, and the picture actually appears real. But I am from his face. My theory is that this is the shadow of one of them, but somehow, because of the lighting and the angle of photography, it appeared in this way. Considering that they were attacked by a Yeti, we may consider it a vague theory, but this theory simply leads us to think about other beings, Huge beings that we know exist and whose power may be even stronger than the legendary Yeti, like the brown bear, one of the most dangerous types of bears found in the Russian mountains. And you also have other types of ferocious animals, such as wolves and Siberian tigers, all of which have a presence in mountainous areas. This type of animal could have surprised the traveler and made them flee from the tent, but we will return again to the same thing. The above is that the footprints of the travelers indicate that they were not terrified when they came out of the tent, and if there was an animal sitting attacking them from outside, they would certainly appear terrified. This theory is still up to you, so let us go to the next theory, which is more logical, which is the oven theory. It talks to us about the oven. What they have inside the tent is a picture of the tents when they were erected in another place before the mountain. You can see here this chimney, which is the chimney of the oven. This oven they use inside the tent for cooking and heating, and the oven was clearly handmade by them. It was made by them. So it was not a single piece. It was a combination of pieces that were on some of them, so that they can remove them with them. And it is clear that this oven sometimes had some problems. In one of the pictures of one of the travelers, he was wearing a jacket that was clearly burned, and there is a high probability that it was burned because of the oven. So we can conclude that the oven was not made excellently and was at high risk in using it, but they still need to rely on it. Well, what does the oven theory say? Is the oven a source of fire in the tent? Of course not, because if this happened, effects of the fire would be evident in the tent. Looking at the oven, it says that it is due to an error in connecting the oven chimney pipes, or because the smoke is blocked instead of coming out of the tent. He went back inside the chimney and the imagination was filled with smoke. When they tried to extinguish the fire, the smoke probably increased more and more. The situation moment was definitely chaotic and difficult for them to open the door of the tent. They were not able to see anything, so the quickest action was to open the tent from the inside and get out. This theory explains why they were calm and organized. Their movement after they came out of the tent, there was nothing that caused panic around it. The panic was inside the tent. This theory I have only one problem with, which is why they did not return to the tent. Why did they come down from the mountain? The answer may be that they thought it was safe for them to come down, instead of remaining in a tent that had a large crack in it. But later, when they went down, they realized that the situation was worse. So some of them tried to return to the tent. Then it is possible that the last theory, and what many believe to be the most logical, is the avalanche theory. The avalanche theory was present from the beginning of the investigations into the case, but there was no evidence of the presence of a large avalanche in this theory was excluded from the beginning. But later some scientific analyses took into account that the travelers dug a flat place on the slope of the mountain in order to set up their tent. So there was a small wall of snow on the side of the tent. This snow wall is small, so it is not supposed to cause any danger to them, but it appears in the wind. Those who pass over such mountains in a type of wind are called winds in English. You'll have a type of wind that descends from the top of the mountain along the slope. Because of this descent, its speed is as high as that of storms, so it is a very strong wind, carrying snow with it, of course. Some scientists have analyzed that this small snow wall that was on the side of the tent was piled up on the edge of the snow because of these winds. the fast winds coming down from the mountain. This small wall turned into a large wall, and the snow above was not stable and the layer below it was weak. So what happened is that this snow collapsed on the tent. He buried it, or buried a large part of it, and it was an avalanche. But it was not a major collapse at the level of the entire mountain. It was a small collapse of the snow wall that was on the side of the tent. But in order for the travelers to get out of the tent, they had to make their way from the inside. And after they got out from under the snow, there is a high probability that they were afraid. There was a large avalanche coming from the top of the mountain, so they decided to come down from the mountain and leave their tent. This may explain the light clothing, or those that were not at the required level in which they came out of the tent. Their remaining clothes were inside the tent, and here comes a question. Travelers with their experience should have known that what was best for them. They dig in the snow, reach their tent, take their belongings, and then they can come down from the mountain. But after that, if they are afraid of an avalanche coming from the top mountain, a logical decision is that they come down and leave the tent. And perhaps after they have descended a little distance and noticed that there is no avalanche coming, they may try to turn the tent around the second time. And they were not able to reach it because the tent was mostly buried under the snow and visibility was difficult at that time. Means that this is a logical analysis and scenario of what happened and explains why they left the tent and went out with clothes that were not adequate for the atmosphere they were in. After that, they stayed together until they did not reach the trees that were under there at the trees. They tried. They were starting a fire. There were traces of some burned branches and traces of fire, but it is clear that these attempts were not successful in the desired way. The fire was not enough to warm it, or it might even go out quickly. There were even traces on some of the trees around the fire if they had tried to climb, perhaps to get some branches, which may be more dry, and they use it to start a fire. And this thing may explain some of the wounds and scars on their bodies after attempts to start a fire among the trees failed. Here most likely the first two people died, including the two who got it later in their underwear. The reason is most likely that their friends who were still alive decided to take them. Their clothes, and they benefit from them, right? It's sad that you take the clothes of your friend who just died frozen in front of you. But this situation is life or death. I mentioned to you that one of these two people who died, the first thing that was in a part of the flesh on his hand, they got it inside his mouth. And most likely he bit that part while he was sitting freezing, because when you freeze, you lose your foundation with his limbs. He might have been sitting trying to hit himself or bite his hand to feel it, but it seems to be over. He was in the last stages after that. It seems that the group split into two parts. The reason for the division is not known. It could be a difference in opinions. The important thing is 3 of them decided to return to the top of the mountain to try to circle the tent again, and 4 decided to go in the second direction and find a different escape route. The 3 who decided to return to the summit and circle the tent froze in the distance of the road, one behind the other. As for the remaining 4, as we said, they found their bodies under 4 meters of snow. And as we said, 3 of these 4 had their bodies in the worst condition. Their rib cages were broken, their skulls were broken, their eyes were missing, and their tongue and lower part of their mouth were still missing. There is no doubt that something violent had happened to them. This spirit requires a different theory to explain it. And there is a theory that it's the place where these four found them. They tried to dig, like a den in the snow, and they brought with them tree branches to support this den or spread its floor. It is true that hiding inside the snow would be a cold for them, but at least under the snow these strong winds would not hit them. And they would try to bury each other with the heat of their bodies, so their chance of survival might be greater. But it seems that the spot where they decided to dig their den had a water stream underneath it. The snow in this place where they were sitting digging did not have enough support for it to hold itself up. It was under the water that was running. When they were sitting digging in this place, the snow beneath them collapsed and they toppled into the stream. The water under the ground collapsed. There were large amounts of snow on top of them. The collapse and the amounts of snow that were crushed from above is the only explanation for the severe injuries and fractures they were exposed to. So the watermen crouched in the place where they got him, some distance under the snow. This stream of water on which their bodies remained could explain why the eyes of two of them, the tongue of one of them, and the bottom of her mouth were there. His bodies remained in the water stream for 2 months until they were not recovered. 1 month was long enough for their bodies to begin to decompose. True, the weather is cold and this reduces the rate of decomposition, but it is normal for the inside of the bodies to begin to decompose. The faces of the 2 bodies that received their eyes were missing, and the ones that obtained had their tongue and the bottom of their mouth missing, were on the stream. The water on their faces fell on the running water. With the slow decomposition of the bodies, and with the running water that was running over their faces, most likely their eyes decomposed and the water washed away the tongue, and the bottom of the mouth disappeared in the same way as it began to decompose and the water washed away. Vast mystery that remains, and what we have not been given any explanation for until now, was the clothes that had traces on them. Nuclear radiation. These pieces of clothing actually belong to only 2 people from the group, Alexander Katov and Ludmila Dubna. It appears that the explanation is as simple as possible. These 2 people were under the illusion that they had graduated from the university and were working in nuclear facilities. After all, one of them was part of the crew that participated in cleaning up the waste of the Kustum. The Kustum nuclear disaster is similar to the Chernobyl disaster, but it happened a long time before it, in 1957, and it is considered the 3rd largest nuclear disaster. Because these 2 people were working in nuclear facilities, and because one of them had already participated in cleanup operations from one of the nuclear disasters, there was nothing strange that their clothes where it has traces of nuclear radiation on it. I think that in this way we have covered all the logical explanations and theories that can explain the events that happened to the 9 travelers in a... By God, thank you for following. I will see you in the next video. Bye.